Redditor 1. I've never told anyone this before, at least not in this much detail. Every time I think about it, my stomach knots up the way it did that night. My palms get damp, and I remember that feeling, like something had its hands on me, unseen, but there. I don't believe in ghosts. I've always been a rational person, the kind of person who finds logical explanations for things. But this one night from my childhood, it's the only thing I've never been able to explain away. My dad was in the military, which meant we moved around a lot. New states, new schools, new friends. At the time, we had just relocated to Fort Knox, Kentucky. I was about 9 or 10, still figuring out the streets, still learning which hallways at school felt safe and which teachers weren't worth making jokes around. It was there that I met Dylan. Dylan was the first real friend I made in Kentucky. He was athletic, quick-witted, and always had a way of making people laugh without trying too hard. We bonded fast, the way kids do when they're thrown into new places with no warning. His dad was military too, so he understood the constant moving, the loneliness of having to start over again and again. One day, he invited me over for his little sister's birthday party. I was excited. It was the first time I was going to a friend's house since the move, the first time I'd see what life was like inside another home here. I didn't think much of it when Dylan started acting a little different on the way there. He wasn't his usual easygoing self. He was tense, quieter. He kept talking about how we should play outside, maybe stick to the basement if we had to be inside. He seemed uneasy, but I figured maybe he just didn't want me messing up his room or something. I didn't ask questions until he mentioned the downstairs bathroom. "Just don't use it," he said, "ever." I laughed at first because the way he said it was weirdly serious. It sounded like a joke, like he was setting me up for some kind of prank. But when I asked him why, he just got quieter. "Because something's in there," he muttered, "and it locks you in." I should have listened. I should have paid attention to the way his voice dropped when he said it, the way he looked over his shoulder like he was making sure nobody or nothing heard him. When we got to his house, everything seemed normal. His mom was there with the cake, his sister was running around excited, and we all played outside for a while. It was just a regular kid's birthday party. I had almost forgotten about the whole bathroom thing until Dylan suddenly said he had to go. He asked me to go upstairs with him. I hesitated because, well, why? Why did he need me to come with him just to pee? There was a perfectly good bathroom downstairs, right by the kitchen, but the look in his eyes stopped me from arguing. It wasn't the look of a kid pulling a prank. He was scared. I went with him, stood outside the door while he used the bathroom, and then when it was my turn, I asked him to do the same for me. "No," he said, shaking his head. I frowned, confused and kind of annoyed. "Why not? I stood here for you." "Just don't shut the door all the way," he said. "Don't let it close. Not here, not anywhere." That was the second red flag. I told him if he wasn't going to do the same for me, then I'd just use the downstairs bathroom instead. The moment I said that, his whole expression changed. "Please don't," he said. "I'm sorry, I'm scared." I didn't get it. His sister walked up then, looking irritated, and said, "He's right, don't use it." That was when I got stubborn. I was a kid, I was annoyed. And honestly, at that point, I was more afraid of peeing my pants in front of my new friend than I was of some stupid bathroom. So I went downstairs. The layout of their house was pretty standard for military housing. When you walked in, the kitchen was to the left, straight ahead was the living room, and right across from the kitchen was the downstairs bathroom. If you looked forward from the bathroom door, you'd see the staircase leading up to the second floor. The bathroom itself was small, just a toilet, a sink, and a mirror. I stepped inside, turned on the light, and locked the door. The moment I unzipped my pants, the light went out. At first, I thought it was just a bad bulb, no big deal. I turned, feeling my way back toward the door, when the light suddenly flicked back on. I froze. Before I could fully process what had just happened, the light went out again. My breath hitched. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, my hands shaking a little. I reached for the doorknob, ready to leave, when the light turned on again. And then off. Off. This wasn't a flickering bulb. This wasn't some electrical issue. The switch was being flipped. I heard it. I spun toward the wall, reaching out in the darkness, and for a split second, my fingers grazed it. The switch. It was moving. I wasn't alone in that bathroom. I yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I twisted the knob, fumbled with the lock, but it was like something was pressing against the other side, holding it shut. I screamed. I threw my whole weight against the door, trying to force it open, but each time I got it open even an inch, something slammed it shut again. The lights kept going, wild, on, off, casting quick, jarring flashes of the small, empty space. Or at least, I thought it was empty. Dylan's mom must have heard me because suddenly I felt someone yanking on the door from the outside. I pulled as hard as I could, and after what felt like forever, the door finally wrenched open and I fell straight into her arms. I was crying, I was shaking. Dylan and his sister stood behind their mom, their faces pale and their eyes wide. Dylan was crying too. His sister was trembling. I couldn't stop shaking. I felt sick, like something had left a mark on me, like I had brushed up against something I wasn't supposed to. His mom didn't say anything, didn't explain, didn't try to make me feel better. She just called my mom, told her to come get me, and I never went back to Dylan's house again. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a cruel prank, though I can't figure out how they could have pulled it off. I don't know if it was just my young mind distorting things, though I still remember the sound of the light switch clicking up and down. I remember the weight pressing against the door. I remember the fear, deep and real and primal. And I remember Dylan's face when he saw me after it happened. He was afraid too. I never saw him again after that. I don't know if his family moved away, if something else happened, or if maybe they just kept to themselves. But sometimes, even now, I think about what he said before we got to his house, about how something was in that bathroom. I wonder how many times he had seen it. I wonder how many times it had locked him in. Redditor 2. I was 6, maybe 7 when I saw her. It wasn't a ghost. At least, I didn't think it was at the time. When you're a kid, your mind doesn't go to those places. The world is simple. Things exist because they exist. You don't question whether someone is supposed to be there or not. We were visiting some relatives I'd never met before, a couple my parents' age who lived on the other side of the city. I don't remember much about them, just that their house smelled like old wood and something floral, like potpourri. My mom was excited, talking about how long it had been, how we should have visited sooner. I wasn't paying much attention to any of that, because the moment we walked in, I saw the girl. She was at the top of the stairs, standing completely still, her hands lightly gripping the stair rail. She was pale, so pale it was almost unnatural, her skin somewhere between white and gray. Her dark brown hair fell around her shoulders, and her eyes were locked onto me. Not moving, not blinking, just staring. I wasn't scared, not then. To me, she was just another kid, maybe someone I'd get to play with later. So, being the loudmouth that I was, I turned to my sister and asked, "Who's that?" I barely had time to finish my sentence before I felt a sharp knee to my back. My sister, who was 15 at the time, didn't answer me. She just shoved me forward, directing me into the living room without a word. It wasn't until much later that I realized she never looked. I got distracted pretty quickly after that. The couple had a cat, a big, fluffy thing that immediately took all of my attention. It rubbed against my legs, let me scratch behind its ears, and before long the girl at the top of the stairs faded to the back of my mind. We stayed for about an hour. The adults talked, my sister mostly kept to herself, and I played with the cat until it was time to go. I didn't think about her again until we were driving home. I turned to my sister in the back seat, still petting the lingering cat hair off my shirt, and asked, "Why didn't the girl come downstairs?" My sister looked at me, confused. "What girl?" "The one at the top of the stairs," I said. "She was right there when we walked in." Her face scrunched in that annoyed way older siblings get when they think you're messing with them. "What are you talking about? There was no girl." I laughed. "Yes, there was. She was right there, holding the stair rail. You had to have seen her." But she just shook her head. "It wasn't a girl." That was the first time I felt something cold creep up my spine. I argued at first, told her she must not have looked, told her she must have been ignoring me like she always did. But she was adamant. She swore over and over that there had been no girl. My mom even turned in her seat and asked what we were talking about. When I told her, she brushed it off, said I must have imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I could still see her perfectly in my mind. Her pale face, her dark hair, the way she stared, unblinking, like she wasn't supposed to be seen but wasn't hiding either. I never brought it up again. Not until years later. I was older then, maybe 14 or 15, when I overheard a conversation between my mom and dad. They were talking about the same relatives, about how hard it must have been for them to lose their daughter. My stomach turned. I barely heard the rest of the conversation, only caught bits and pieces. She had died young, maybe 9. It was an illness, something quick, something that took her before anyone was ready. It had happened years before we ever visited. I sat there, frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. She had been 9. The girl I saw at the top of the stairs, she had looked about 9. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that my memory was playing tricks on me, that maybe I'd heard about her before and my mind had conjured an image to match. But I knew that wasn't true. I had never heard about her. I hadn't even known she existed until that moment. But I had seen her. I had seen her standing there, watching me. Expressionless, silent, unmoving. And nobody else had. Even now, years later, I still remember the way she looked, the way she stared, the way my sister didn't even glance in her direction before shoving me forward. At the time, she hadn't looked scary to me. Now, looking back, now I realize just how wrong it was. Reddit or two. The first time I heard her, I thought I was dreaming. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was wrapped in that eerie silence that only exists when the rest of the world is asleep. I had been out cold, deep in some forgotten dream, when a voice, small, clear, and undeniably real, pulled me out of it. Hello? I woke up fast, the way you do when something feels wrong. But there was nothing, no movement, no shadows, just the faint glow of the streetlight through my window and the quiet hum of the night. My heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was something else, something quieter, like recognition. I waited, straining my ears against the silence, but there was nothing. I turned over, pressing my face into my pillow, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a leftover fragment of a dream, the echo of something my mind had conjured up. But as I lay there, my eyes drifting closed, I swore I felt something. Not a presence, not quite. More like attention. It happened again months later, maybe longer. By then, I had forgotten about the first time. I had dismissed it the way people dismiss strange moments in the dark, just a trick of the mind, just a weird dream. But then, in that same deep part of the night, I heard it again. Hello? The same voice, the same soft, innocent tone, like a child calling out into a world that never answered. I sat up, my heart hammering, and this time, I responded. Hello? My own voice sounded foreign in the quiet. I waited, staring into the darkness, hoping for something, anything to answer me back. But there was nothing. She never spoke often. Only once in a great while, as if she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to. Always just a single word, always the same greeting, like she was waiting for something more. And every time, I felt no fear. If anything, I felt sorry for her. I imagined her alone in some space I couldn't understand, reaching out, hoping someone, anyone, would acknowledge her. I started to wonder if she even knew what she was, or if she had ever realized that she wasn't alive anymore. The last time she spoke to me was just before we moved out. I had been expecting it in a way, though I didn't realize it until it happened. This time, there was no hesitation, no loneliness in her voice, just that small, simple word again. Hello? I didn't sit up right away. I was used to it by then. But before I could respond, she did something new. She giggled. It was light, almost playful, and for the first time I felt a chill run down my spine. Not because it was sinister, because it felt real. Too real. It was the kind of sound you hear from an actual child, not an echo from something long gone. But as soon as it happened, it was over. There was no more, just silence, as if she had finally grown tired of waiting for me to give her the response she wanted. I never heard her again. We moved, left that house behind, and life went on. But every so often I think about her. I wonder if she's still there, if she's still calling out in the middle of the night, hoping someone will answer her. I know that another family moved in after us, a couple with young children, and I wonder if, in the quietest hours of the night, one of those kids has woken up to the sound of a small voice whispering, "Hello?" Sometimes I think about going back, knocking on their door, striking up casual conversation. I wonder what they'd say if I looked them in the eye and asked, "So, have your kids met Charlotte?" Because I know deep down that she's still there, and I know just as surely that she's found someone new to talk to. Redditor 3. The trailer always felt a little off, but I ignored it at first. It was just an old place. Creaky floors, thin walls, and the kind of isolation that made every sound at night seem louder than it was. I told myself it was nothing, even when things started happening. Even when I started waking up in the middle of the night to a shadow standing in my doorway, watching me. I never told anyone about that at first. Not my brother, not my friends. I figured I was just dreaming, half awake, my mind playing tricks on me. But then there were the other things. The heater turning on in the dead of summer, the AC blasting in the winter, the way things in the kitchen never stayed where I left them. Still, I brushed it off. It was just a trailer. Old, poorly wired, shifting in the dirt it sat on. I told myself that over and over, until the night the front door opened on its own. There were 4 of us there, my brother, 2 friends, and me, just drinking, talking, killing time. My brother and I were standing in the middle of the living room, our friends on the couch, when we all heard it. Footsteps on the porch steps. Slow, deliberate. We all went quiet, listening. Someone was walking up to the front door. I looked at my brother, he looked at me. No one else was supposed to be here. Then the footsteps reached the landing, a heavy pause, and then the door flew open. Not a creak, not a slow push, but a full force slam against the wall. And then, as if someone had just stepped inside, we felt it. The floor shook slightly, just the way it does when someone heavy walks through a trailer. I swear I could feel something brush between us, moving through the space, even though there was no one there. We all lost it. My brother, my friends, me. We backed up, eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything. But the door was open, the porch empty, the night beyond it just still and black. And yet, we had felt something walk between us. That was the night none of us could deny it anymore. The trailer was haunted. It didn't stop after that. If anything, it got worse. The same 2 friends were over again another night, my brother there too, all of us drinking, trying to pretend we hadn't all been terrified before. I had a kitchen timer, shaped like a bell pepper, that sat on the back of my stove. It had always been there, had never moved. Until that night. I wasn't even looking at it when it happened. One second we were talking, the next I heard the sharp clatter of plastic smacking against the wall. We all turned, just in time to see it hit the floor on the other side of the room. None of us had touched it. That's when I really started paying attention to everything. The weird shifts in temperature weren't just random anymore. It was always the opposite of what it should be. The heater blasting in the middle of the summer, the AC running full blast in the dead of winter. I started waking up more often to that same shadow in my doorway, never moving, never speaking, just standing there, watching. But the worst part, the part that I still can't shake, was the dream. It wasn't like a normal dream. It never changed, never shifted into something else. Every time it was the same thing, a man named Chris, tied to a chair in my bedroom, beaten to hell, his face swollen, bloody, his breathing ragged. The room was empty except for the chair. The overhead light was just a bare bulb, flickering, casting long shadows against the walls. I don't know how I knew his name. He never spoke, but I knew he was Chris, and something bad had happened to him. I had that dream over and over while I lived there. I started waking up from it gasping for air, sweating, feeling like I had been in the room with him, like I had heard the blows landing. And every time, I'd wake up to that same shadow in my doorway. Like it was waiting for me to figure something out. I moved out eventually. I had to. I was barely sleeping, constantly on edge, always waiting for the next thing to happen. I still don't know who Chris was. I don't know if something terrible happened in that trailer before I lived there, or if it was something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that place, and whatever was there, it wasn't just passing through. It had been waiting. Redditor 4. I was young when it happened, but I remember every detail clearly. It wasn't like a dream where things blur together or slip away with time. This memory was burned into me, etched so deep that even now I can recall the flickering light, the shifting air, and the way my body refused to move. It started as any other night. I decided to go to bed a little earlier than usual, which was rare for me. Looking back, I wonder if something had guided me into that moment, if there had been some force at play that wanted me to see what I saw. Maybe if I had stayed up, maybe if I had fought against the pull of sleep, I never would have encountered it. But I did go to bed early, and because of that, everything changed. So today, I've got something in common with thousands of people I talk to, and I've got to discover why. I remember walking down the hall, rubbing my eyes, already half lost in sleep. The house was quiet, but not in an unsettling way. My parents were still awake in the living room, the TV humming softly, their voices murmuring in casual conversation. The hallway light cast a warm glow, stretching toward my bedroom door. There was nothing strange, nothing out of place. And then I stepped into the doorway. The moment I did, my entire body tensed. There was no reason for it, no immediate danger, but I felt it in my gut. An instinctive, primal warning that something was wrong. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why. The room looked the same, the bed was made, my dresser was where it had always been. Everything was as it should be. But then I saw the walls. They were flickering, not like the way light shifts when a car passes by, not like the subtle changes when clouds move over the moon. This was different. The walls pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, like static on an old television screen. A shifting white noise that didn't belong. It made the entire space feel distorted, unreal, like I had stepped into something that wasn't meant for me. That's when I saw it. A figure walking toward me. It was human-shaped, but not human at all. Every inch of it was flickering, shifting, as if it were made entirely of static. The movement wasn't natural. It didn't glide the way a ghost might, nor did it walk like a person. It hovered about 1.5 feet above the ground, taking slow, deliberate steps forward, moving with an intent that sent ice through my veins. It didn't have a face, but I knew it was looking at me, focused, locked in. 2 steps. That's how far it had moved by the time I realized it was there. 2 more, and it would be within arm's reach. My body refused to respond. Every muscle locked in place, every breath caught in my throat. I wanted to turn, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, helpless, trapped in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights, watching as it came closer. My mind was screaming at me, my instincts clawing at me to move, but nothing happened. It was like my body didn't belong to me anymore. And then, somehow, I found my voice. Run. The second the word left my lips, it was like a spell had broken. My legs finally listened. I turned so fast that I nearly stumbled, slamming into the hallway wall as I bolted. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, my vision blurred by the sheer panic flooding my system. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran straight to my parents' room and threw myself onto their bed, burying myself between them, my entire body trembling. I had never done that before. I wasn't the kind of kid who crawled into my parents' bed after a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. It couldn't have been. My parents were confused, half asleep, asking me what was wrong. I couldn't answer them. What could I even say? That something made of static had walked toward me? That my walls had been glowing? It sounded insane, even in my own head. So I stayed silent. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, and I fell asleep between them. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to my room. The walls were normal. The air felt still. Everything was the way it should have been. It almost made me doubt myself. Almost. But I knew what I had seen. I could still feel the lingering presence of it, a weight in the air, a pressure that told me something had been there, and maybe, just maybe, it still was. For years, I never spoke about it. I wanted to believe that it had been a hallucination, a strange waking dream. But every so often, when the house was quiet, I would feel that same pressure again, a heavy stillness that made my skin prickle. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I would catch the faintest flicker of light in the corner of my vision, a brief pulse that disappeared the second I turned my head. I never saw it again, but that didn't mean it was gone. And that terrified me more than anything. Because if it wasn't gone, then where was it? Years later, I finally told someone. I had long since moved out of that house, had buried the memory deep, convincing myself it had been nothing more than a childhood illusion. But one night, sitting around with friends, the conversation turned to strange experiences, ghost stories, things people had seen that defied explanation. I hesitated before speaking, but then I told them. I told them everything, the flickering walls, the static figure, the way it moved toward me without sound, without hesitation, how I had been frozen, unable to move, until I finally forced myself to say the word. I expected them to laugh, to dismiss it, but one of them didn't. He sat in silence for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I've seen it too." The words hit me harder than I expected. My stomach clenched, my breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly, like he was weighing his words. "I saw something just like that when I was a kid, but I couldn't run. I couldn't move at all. It just stood over me, flickering, like it was waiting for something. I thought I was going to die." The room went completely silent. For the first time in my life, I felt something worse than fear. Recognition. It wasn't just me, it wasn't just my room. Whatever it was still out there. And if it had come for me, if it had come for him, then who else had seen it? And who was next? Redditor 5. Our family has a house in a small town in the mountains of Virginia. It's old, over 100 years at least. The kind of place that creaks even when no one is walking, where the floorboards shift in ways that don't make sense, where the air feels heavier in some rooms than in others. It sits at the bottom of a hill, and at the very top of that hill, there's a cemetery. Growing up, I was always told the house was haunted, not just a vague, "this place feels weird" kind of haunted, but a name, a presence. Mr. Hicks. His grave was in that cemetery at the top of the hill. I never questioned why people believed he was the one haunting the house. It was just a fact, passed down like family history. He was there. That was just how it was. You didn't talk about it too much, didn't dwell on it, because that only made things worse. But I always felt it, the presence, the way the air would feel thicker sometimes, the way I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision and turn to see nothing there. It was constant, an unspoken part of being in that house. To this day, I hate being there alone. But there was one night, one moment, that solidified everything for me, that made me know for certain that whatever haunted that house was real. I was 11, sharing a bed with my brother in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The house had plenty of strange rooms, odd layouts that didn't make much sense. But this room? This one was the worst. It had a small door inside the closet that led to another room. You couldn't access that space from anywhere else in the house. It was isolated, closed off. And the second you stepped inside, something changed. The air was different. The silence was louder. You could feel it. Even as a kid, I knew that little room inside the closet wasn't right. That night, my brother and I lay there in the dark, trying to sleep. The air was still, thick with the kind of quiet that settles deep in your chest. I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I was just waiting to drift off. And then, I felt it. The bed shifted. Not a small movement, not the way it does when you roll over. Something sat down at the end of the bed. I didn't see anything at first, but I felt it. The weight, the sudden pressure pulling the mattress down. It stayed there, unmoving, pressing into the blankets for what felt like 30 full seconds. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. My mind was racing, my body locked in place. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, that the old house was just settling. But when I finally worked up the courage to lift my head, I saw it. The blanket was indented. Something invisible was sitting there. I reached over and nudged my brother, whispering, "Did you feel that?" He was facing away from me, but I could hear the tension in his voice when he said, "Just go back to sleep." That was when I knew. He had felt it too. He just didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there staring at the spot where the weight had been, terrified that whatever it was would move, would shift, would crawl closer. But it didn't. It just sat there, completely unseen, before eventually the weight lifted. The bed slowly returned to normal. Morning came and neither of us talked about it, not a word. It was as if we had made some silent agreement to pretend it hadn't happened, to act as though the night had been perfectly normal. But it wasn't. Years passed. I grew older, moved away, tried to leave the memories of that house behind, but the feeling never left me, the certainty of it, the knowing. And then not too long ago, I finally brought it up to my brother. Casual at first, just testing the waters, trying to see if maybe I had imagined it. "Hey," I said, "do you remember that night when something sat on the bed?" He went quiet. For a second, I thought he would brush it off, tell me I was being ridiculous. But then, finally, he exhaled and said, "Yeah, I remember." That was all I needed. It hadn't just been me. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel crazy. Redditor 6. I understand now. Here's the story, written exactly how you prefer. Longer, immersive, and without excessive line breaks. March 2018 was supposed to be a time of change, a fresh start for our family. We had just moved into a new house, a place meant to be filled with new memories and new beginnings. The air still carried the scent of fresh paint, and boxes were stacked in every corner, waiting to be unpacked. My grandparents had just left for Nicaragua, their home country, a week before. My dad had driven them to the airport, hugged them goodbye, and returned home, not knowing that would be the last time he'd ever see his father alive. That morning, when my mom sat us down and said the words, "Your grandpa died," the world seemed to stop. I had never lost a relative before. Death had always been something distant, something that happened to other people, to strangers in stories, to people in movies. But not to us, not to him. Just last week he was fine. He had been alive, walking, talking, boarding a plane with my grandmother, heading toward what was supposed to be the next chapter of their lives, and now he was gone. My mom told us it had been a stroke, sudden and in his sleep. My grandmother had found him in bed, motionless, unresponsive, his body already cold. She had called an ambulance, but by the time they got him to the hospital, there was nothing they could do. He was already gone. It didn't seem real. How could someone just stop existing overnight? For days, I struggled to understand it, but then my mother told me something that made my stomach twist in ways grief never had before. The night before he died, she had dreamed about it. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, just a strange nightmare she couldn't shake. In the dream, she saw him lying still, not breathing, the room around him eerily silent. She had woken up unsettled but brushed it off. It was just a dream, she told herself, until the next morning when the phone rang and reality matched what her mind had seen the night before. Even then, I didn't consider anything paranormal. Maybe it was coincidence, a trick of the subconscious. Maybe she had sensed something was wrong without realizing it. That was easy enough to believe. But then, strange things started happening in the house. At first it was small things, flickering lights, misplaced objects, a chair that seemed to be slightly pulled out from the table when no one had touched it. My mom started claiming she was seeing him, not in dreams, not in memories, but here, in the house, in plain sight. The first time she had been walking into the living room and saw him sitting in his old chair, not a shadow, not a blurry vision, but as real as he had been in life. She gasped, blinked, and he was gone. She didn't tell us right away, afraid we'd think she was imagining things, but after it happened more than once, she couldn't keep it to herself. "I see him," she said one evening at dinner. My dad looked at her, confused. "Who?" he asked. "My father." The room went silent. My dad tried to reassure her, telling her it was just her mind playing tricks, that it was grief making her see things. But my mom was certain. "He's here," she said. "I don't think he ever left." And then, the things that had been small and dismissible became impossible to ignore. The TV turning on by itself late at night, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when we were all in bed, the heater turning on in the middle of the night full blast, even though no one had touched the thermostat. One night, I woke up to the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone in my room. The air felt thick, heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. My skin prickled, every instinct in my body telling me to stay still. I lay frozen, my breath shallow, afraid to turn my head, afraid to look, afraid of what I might see. It was the same feeling you get when someone is standing right behind you, but you know no one should be there. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually the feeling faded, like a weight lifting off my chest. The room returned to normal, but I knew what I had felt. The next morning, my mom asked me if I had heard anything strange during the night. I hesitated before shaking my head. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to add to whatever was happening, but deep down, I knew something was there. My grandpa had died in another country thousands of miles away, but somehow, some way, he had found his way back to us. Redditor 7. I grew up in an old farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of house that had seen generations come and go, its bones creaking under the weight of history. It was built in the early 1800s, and every home in the area carried that same sense of age, of something lingering just beneath the surface. Down the road there was a barn with an underground railroad hideout beneath it, a place where people had once hidden in the dark, waiting, hoping. I always wondered if echoes of their fear still clung to the land, if the weight of the past never truly left. We moved into that house when I was in second grade. It should have been exciting, a fresh start, a new place to call home. But almost immediately I felt it, that presence, the thing that made the air feel heavy, the silence feel full. It wasn't something I could see, but I could sense it, lurking in the corners, just beyond where my eyes could reach. At first I told myself it was nothing, a child's imagination. But then, one night, I learned that it wasn't. It was late, long past bedtime, and I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that should have been comforting but instead felt suffocating. My room was small, with just a bed, a dresser, and a garbage bag full of clothes in the corner, the kind of thing you keep when you've outgrown them, waiting to be donated or packed away. I don't know what made me notice it, but suddenly the bag moved. At first it was just a faint crinkling sound, like plastic shifting under its own weight. I told myself it was settling, the way objects sometimes do, and tried to ignore it. But then it happened again, sharper this time, a deliberate rustling like something inside was shifting. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I didn't move, I just lay there, staring at it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I heard it. A sound, quiet but distinct, like someone sucking spit through their teeth. Chink. It was low, drawn out, unnatural, and it came from inside the bag. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body locked up, my fingers gripping the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. The bag sat still for a moment, like whatever was inside was waiting. Then, without warning, it tipped over, not just a slight shift. It fell, spilling clothes across the floor, the weight of it moving as if something inside had pushed its way free. That was all I needed. I ran, bolted out of the room so fast my feet barely touched the floor, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my parents' bedroom, throwing myself between them, shaking, unable to speak. I didn't tell them what had happened. I didn't need to. They just let me stay, and I clung to the safety of their presence, too terrified to return to my room. The next morning, when the sunlight had erased some of the night's terror, I forced myself to go back. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the bag had just fallen over naturally. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But when I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The bag wasn't just tipped over. The clothes were pulled out, scattered across the floor, like something had been searching through them. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was no explanation, nothing that made sense. That was the last night I ever slept in that room. From then on, I started sleeping in the living room, every night, for years. I never talked about it, never tried to explain why. I just knew I couldn't go back. As I got older, the house never stopped feeling off. There were always shadows that didn't belong, whispers in the walls that had no source, cold spots that crept up my spine even in the dead of summer. I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, quick and darting, disappearing before I could turn my head. And the worst part? The feeling that it was subtle at first, just an awareness, a pressure in the air. But then it became more. Sometimes, I'd be sitting in the living room at night, the glow of the TV the only light in the house, and I'd feel it, a weight behind me, the sense that if I turned around, something would be standing there, just waiting. I never turned. I never wanted to know. Years passed, and eventually we moved. I should have felt relieved, finally leaving that place behind. But even now, when I think about that house, about the things I felt in it, I wonder, did I leave it behind, or did it follow me? Redditor 8. It was late, 3 a.m., the kind of late where the streets are empty, where the world feels like it's holding its breath. My friend and I had just come from a party, nothing wild, just a bunch of kids hanging out, and now I was waiting outside her house while her mom came to open the door. The air was cool, the kind of stillness that makes every little sound feel louder than it should. I should have been tired, half asleep on my feet, but something caught my eye. A blue light? It was coming from one of the windows, washing the glass in a strange, electric glow. It stood out against the darkness of the street, almost unnatural in how bright it was. It wasn't the soft flicker of a TV or the dim buzz of a nightlight. It was stronger, deeper, more intense. The color was unlike anything I'd seen in a normal house at that hour. It drew me in. I stepped closer, peering through the window, expecting to see the source. What I saw instead made my breath catch in my throat. A silhouette. A small figure sat near the window, bathed in that pulsing blue light. It was still, unmoving, almost too still. The glow wrapped around it, outlining its form, making it impossible to miss. My immediate thought was that it had been my friend's younger brother, up late watching something, maybe playing video games. The light had to be from a screen, right? That was the logical explanation. It was weird, sure, but not terrifying. I didn't think much of it. I turned away, the cold settling into my skin, and by the time her mother unlocked the door, I had already pushed the image to the back of my mind. The next morning, over breakfast, I casually asked my friend why her brother had been up so late. She paused, fork halfway to her mouth, and frowned. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "Last night, when we got here, that blue light in the window, I saw him sitting there." Her face went blank, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "My brother's at my dad's house this weekend," she said slowly. "It's just me and my mom here." The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against my plate. I replayed it in my head, trying to make sense of it. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't half asleep. I wasn't imagining things. There had been someone sitting in that room, surrounded by that eerie blue glow. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was real. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe someone had left a TV on. Maybe... "Come with me," I said. I needed to see the room. I needed to prove to myself that there had been an explanation, something I had overlooked. We walked down the hall, my pulse picking up with every step. When she finally opened the door, I felt my stomach twist into knots. The room was nothing like I expected. It was small, too small for what I had seen. There were no electronics, no TV, no lamps. Just stacks of old furniture covered in sheets, the air thick with dust. A storage room, a place untouched, abandoned. And yet, just hours ago, I had seen something inside it. I stared at the space where the figure had been, my mind racing. There was no explanation, no way I had seen what I thought I saw. The blue light had been so vivid, so unnatural, and yet there was nothing here that could have created it. My friend must have seen the look on my face because she shifted uncomfortably. "Are you sure it wasn't just a reflection?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I shook my head. I didn't know how to explain it, but I knew what I had seen. I never brought it up again, but sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I find myself thinking about that room, about the figure that had been sitting there, bathed in that impossible blue glow. And I wonder if, somewhere, somehow, it's still there, watching. Redditor 9. I was 8, maybe 9, and I remember that night with absolute clarity. Not because it was exciting or fun, but because it was the first time I knew, not just believed, not just imagined, but knew that something existed beyond what we could see. Something real. Something I could hear. It was late, well past bedtime, but I couldn't sleep. I didn't know why, just that no matter how much I turned over, closed my eyes, or tried to force my body into relaxation, sleep refused to come. My mind drifted between half-formed thoughts and boredom. My eyes locked on the ceiling as I waited for exhaustion to take over. Then I started to feel off. It wasn't sudden, it crept in slowly like a bad taste in the back of my throat, a queasy unease that settled deep in my stomach. It wasn't just restlessness anymore. I felt sick. Not the kind of sickness that makes you run to the bathroom, but something wrong, something pressing down on me in a way I couldn't explain. I pulled the covers over my head, cocooning myself in the warmth of my blanket, hoping it would help me settle. Maybe I was cold, maybe that was it. If I just stayed under here long enough, I'd warm up and finally get some sleep. I lay there, breathing steadily, trying to let the darkness inside my blanket lull me to sleep. That's when I heard the footsteps. Tip, tap, slow, quiet coming up the stairs. I froze. We lived in a small house. My parents' room was down the hall. My siblings were all asleep. Everyone was asleep. No one should have been moving around. But someone was. Tip, tap. Each step was deliberate, measured, unhurried. They weren't heavy. No loud thumps, no creaking floorboards, just soft, careful taps, like someone walking in socks or bare feet. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound got closer, moving up the stairs, each step bringing it nearer to the top. Tip, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my blanket so tight my fingers ached. Don't move, don't breathe, don't even think. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then, nothing. Silence. A long, stretching pause that made the air in my room feel thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, listening so hard it made my head hurt. And then, I heard it. A whistle. Low, quiet, almost playful. The footsteps started again, but this time they were inside my room. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. I lay there, trapped under my blanket, my heart hammering so fast it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The steps moved closer. Not across the room, not near the door, beside my bed. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of someone standing there. The energy in the room had shifted, the air colder, heavier, my skin prickled, my breath shallow, careful, desperate not to make a sound. I stayed like that, curled under the covers, my fingers digging into the fabric so hard I thought I might tear it. The whistling stopped after a few seconds, the footsteps didn't return, but I knew it was still there. I didn't sleep, I didn't dare move. I stayed hidden, locked in the darkness of my blanket, until the first hints of morning light slipped through my window. Only then, when the safety of daylight finally arrived, did I dare to peek out. There was nothing there. But I knew what I had heard. I never told my parents, never told my siblings. But after that night, I couldn't ignore what I had once dismissed as silly stories or imagination. Ghosts weren't just possible. I knew they were real. Redditor 10. I have always been open to the idea that some things in this world can't be explained. But there are moments in my life that have cemented it. Moments that replay in my mind years later, leaving me unsettled in ways I can't quite shake. I have two stories that stand out. Two separate experiences that, even now, make me question just how thin the barrier is between the living and the dead. The first happened when I was just a child, maybe 6 or 7. My parents had taken me on a guided tour of the Winchester Mystery Mansion, a place drenched in history, tragedy, and an undeniable sense of something lingering. Even as a kid, I remember feeling drawn to it, fascinated by its twisting hallways and endless rooms. It felt alive in a way that most buildings didn't. I remember thinking how much I wanted to stay there forever, to explore its secrets, to lose myself in its strange and winding design. Near the end of the tour, something happened that still sits in the back of my mind like a splinter. We had paused in one of the many elaborate rooms, the guide speaking about its history, her voice soft and measured. That's when I heard it. A cough, but not just any cough. It was deep, raw, the kind that shakes a person to their core, the kind that takes over your whole body and leaves you gasping for air. It was violent, painful, the unmistakable sound of someone struggling to breathe. I knew that sound well. I had suffered from terrible asthma as a kid, had spent many nights wheezing, struggling, feeling like my own lungs were betraying me. The sound triggered something deep inside me, a familiar ache of sympathy. Whoever that man was, he was in pain. He needed help. I raised my hand. The tour guide paused, looking at me with a polite smile. Yes? I pointed in the direction I had heard the sound. Is someone sick? I asked. One of the workers? Her brow furrowed. No, dear, she said, glancing around at the group. Why do you ask? I blinked. Because someone's coughing. A man. He sounds like he should go home. Silence. My parents looked at me, confused. The other guests, all women except for my father, exchanged puzzled glances. No one else heard anything, the guide said, still smiling, but now there was something else in her eyes. A flicker of something unreadable. I stared at her, then at my parents. How could no one else have heard it? It had been so loud, so... We finished the tour, and as we were leaving, my mother placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said gently, William Winchester died of tuberculosis. I didn't say anything, but I felt the weight of it settle into my chest. I knew what tuberculosis did to the lungs. I had learned about it in school. The constant coughing, the struggle to breathe, the slow, painful suffocation. I never forgot that sound. The second experience happened years later, long after I had grown up, after childhood stories of ghosts had turned into passing curiosities rather than things that kept me up at night. My partner and I had gone to visit my childhood best friend and her boyfriend at their apartment. It had been years since we had all hung out together, and the night was spent catching up, reminiscing, laughing over old memories. At one point, I noticed a framed picture hanging on the wall. It was recent, featuring a guy about our age, smiling like he had a secret, the kind of photo that felt alive, like the person in it was still in the room with us. Who's that? I asked. My friend's face changed, her smile faltering just slightly. That's our friend, she said quietly. You actually met him a few times at local shows. I frowned, trying to recall. The face was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. He passed away recently, she continued. And ever since we put that picture up, well, weird things have been happening. I felt a chill creep up my arms. What do you mean? The frame doesn't stay put, her boyfriend chimed in. We'll come home and find it on the floor. Sometimes it's moved, like someone tilted it. Like he's trying to tell us something, my friend added, forcing a small laugh, but I could tell it unsettled her. I didn't know what to say. Maybe it was just a faulty hook. Maybe the apartment had drafts they didn't notice. But still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my stomach. We didn't stay too late that night, and by the time my partner and I got home, I was exhausted. I crawled into bed, my body sinking into the mattress, the weight of sleep pulling me under fast. Until I woke up. I don't know what time it was. The room was dark, my partner asleep beside me. I had no reason to be awake. I wasn't thirsty, I didn't need the bathroom. Nothing had startled me, but something felt off. I rolled onto my back, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and then I saw it. A face, floating above me, about 5 feet in the air. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a normal face. It was pale, unnaturally white, its features wrong. No nose. Hollow, dark holes where the eyes should have been. The mouth was just a black, empty void, stretched unnaturally like an elongated peanut shell. It didn't move. It just hovered, staring down at me with its hollow eyes. Something deep inside me told me that if I acknowledged it, if I reacted at all, it would get worse. So I shut my eyes, pressed myself against my partner's back, and thought, nope, too early for this, I'm going back to sleep. It felt like an eternity before I drifted off again. But eventually, exhaustion won. When morning came, the room was empty, no sign of what I had seen, but I knew better than to dismiss it as a dream. I never told my friend about it, never told her that, after seeing her friend's picture, after hearing about the frame falling off the wall, something had followed me home. And sometimes even now I wonder, did I really leave it behind? Or is it just waiting for the right moment to be seen again? Redditor limit. It happened when I was young at a friend's house, the kind of house where strange things happened all the time. Their dog would bark at empty chairs, staring at something the rest of us couldn't see. Every once in a while, a priest would come by to bless the place, as if trying to keep something at bay. I never liked being there alone, and sleeping over was the worst part. Even as a kid, I could tell something wasn't right about that house. But one night, something happened that I know wasn't my imagination. Something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and 3 of us were in the basement playing a game. I wasn't even the one playing at that moment. I was sitting, watching my friends mess around, completely at ease. The basement was dimly lit, the old TV screen casting a soft glow against the walls. It should have been just another night. But then, everything shifted. I don't know how to describe it. The air felt thick, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when you know something is about to break. A deep, bone-deep unease crept over me, making every instinct in my body scream that I shouldn't be here. I turned my head to the left. There was a chair beside me, and in it, sitting perfectly still, was my friend. Except my friend was right in front of me, playing the game, completely unaware of what I was seeing. The thing in the chair was identical. Same clothes, same hair, same expressionless stare. But it wasn't him. It was just sitting there, watching me. I felt every muscle in my body lock up. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The thing in the chair didn't move, didn't blink. It just sat there, looking straight at me, like it knew I could see it. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted up the stairs, my screams tearing through the quiet house. My friends followed, confused, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't even form words. I just knew I had to get out. When we finally stopped in the kitchen, I was shaking. They kept asking me what I saw, but they hadn't noticed anything. Nothing had been there, they insisted. They had seen nothing, but I knew what I had seen. It was him, and it wasn't. That wasn't even the first time something had happened in that basement. The TV would turn on and off by itself, sometimes even change channels. We'd hear footsteps upstairs when no one was home. We'd feel watched, a constant weight pressing down on us. Their mom had theories. She thought maybe it was her own mother lingering in the house, watching over them. But I didn't believe that. Whatever was in that house didn't feel comforting. It didn't feel like something watching over. It felt like something waiting. And the worst part? That wasn't the last time I saw it. I started having dreams about that basement. Over and over, I'd find myself standing at the bottom of the stairs, unable to move, unable to turn away from the dark corners of the room. I'd feel something staring back at me, something unseen but there. And sometimes, just before I woke up, I'd see it again. My friend. But not. I never slept over again after that. I could deal with the weird noises, the flickering lights, even the dog growling at empty chairs. But after that night, after seeing whatever that thing was, I knew one thing for sure. I never wanted to be alone in that basement again.